Over the last few days of Craftmas, you might have noticed that this sweater has featured in quite a few videos, if not probably every single video, and that is for a good reason. I wanted to give you a little bit of a hint of what we're going to be doing for the back half of Craftmas. This idea was inspired by last year's Craftmas, where I took a vintage knitting pattern and I made up that entire set, mittens, cap, and sweater for Craftmas, but this year I want to turn this particular vintage knit into an entire set that I can wear. So I want to make a copy and add extra pieces to complete this kind of trio. If you remember the video from last year, then you'll know that it is pretty popular around the 40s, 50s, 60s to have knitting patterns for basically ski sets. I love that idea, so I want to make an entire set that matches this one. However, to create a copy of this sweater, I think we first need to investigate exactly how this one was made, what construction style is it, so that I can make a rough pattern that I can use to copy it. The way that I like to do that is to actually take this sweater, I'm going to take it off, turn it inside out, and look at the details of its construction. My favorite way to investigate vintage sweaters is by looking at the inner bits, the guts of the construction. The inside of a sweater, I feel like, always has a ton of secrets and information that it can tell us on the construction, how something was designed, how it was knit up, and more. So as I want to create a copy of this sweater, I think looking at the inside is a great way to get some clues. So first of all, I like to look at where the seams are. So we have a seam up the side here and a seam around the armholes, which tells me that this sweater was knit at least in 2 pieces, probably more, at least 4 pieces, the front, the back, and each sleeve. However, what's interesting to note here, and this is the first vintage sweater that I've seen that is like this, we do not have a seam under the arm, which means that while this arm is knit flat up here at the sleeve head or sleeve cap, we do not have flat knitting all the way down the arm. Instead, we go into the round. And I think it's interesting to see that you can also tell that there is a difference in the tension between the flat work of the knitting and the round work of the knitting. There are some rows where the tension is a little bit uneven. I had the same thing happen too, so it's just a cool thing to note and pick out. The next thing that I notice is that we have shaping at the top of the shoulders. And with the way that this shaping is done, and it's sewn together on the shoulders too, it makes me think that this sweater was knit from the bottom up. So we started down here at the bottom with a ribbing and knit it up, and that is also very, very common for vintage sweaters. The next thing I think that really stands out to probably all of us is this color work, and you can see it here from the back. You can see some really fascinating, nice long floats happening, but the floats aren't always fully connected between the pieces. So there is, on this particular row, there is this bright orange red happening over here as well as over here, but there's no float connecting the two, which makes me think that there is a combination of kind of Fair Isle as well as Intarsia color work. So maybe this was a separate ball of that bright pink orange color, and then this was another ball of that bright orange pink color. Any particular reason they did that, I'm not sure, to be honest, because they still have these really long floats, but maybe they were trying to avoid having the long floats coming directly across the center here. They could have also chosen to make each one of these its own Intarsia knit pattern without any floats at all, but it looks like they just decided to eliminate these long floats. It doesn't seem like they did much long float management where you would twist the stitches around each other to kind of lock these in place. And I do notice it, especially on the sleeves. When I put this sweater on, my fingers and hands tend to catch on these, so I make a conscious effort to make a fist when I'm putting these on to try to minimize tugging on these long floats. So that's something to consider, is rather than having these long floats, is to maybe do an Intarsia style of color work instead, because I think the reason they don't do the interlocking is your background and main color is this light cream, and I think it would really show through if you lock these long floats in place by twisting them around the other stitches. It does poke through a little bit, I personally have found. Another interesting thing to note is that there is shaping around the neck hole in the front. So this is how I can tell the front from the back of the sweater. If we turn it around and look at the back of the sweater, we do have the shoulder shaping, so the shoulders slope, but there is no neckline shaping. The neckline shaping really only happens on the front of the sweater. And I was sitting here and puzzling over these side stitches for a bit because it almost looks like there was a chain happening here, like some sort of chain stitch on the sides, and it made me scratch my head on what exactly the knitter did. But what I think this is, you can see we knit up and then we only worked on this portion and we only worked on this portion. And when we're working on this portion, if you slip on one side and either knit or purl on the next row, so you slip one row, knit or purl the next row, slip one row on the first or last stitch, you get this really neat edge. And I think that's what they did. I forget exactly what kind of edge that's called again, but basically the edge where you slip the first or last stitch and then you knit or purl it on the next row, that's where you get this kind of really even edging, and I think that's what they knit into here. The other thing that you'll notice about this collar is I believe that these stitches right before the ribbing were left live on the front and then as well on the back here, and then stitches were picked up where we had this neckline shaping happening, and that's how you knit the collar around. And I think that lends to a really stretchy collar area. The only non-stretchy bit is really here and there where the shaping happened, but it leaves the rest nice and stretchy, so it makes it really easy to pull this on over my head, even though the turtleneck is quite long. So I definitely want to mimic that because I like wearing turtlenecks, but they make me really claustrophobic if they're way too tight for me to pull on over my head. The other thing to note about this particular sweater is what kind of yarn is it made out of? Last year when we did this, I had the luxury of having a microscope at my disposal so I could look at each individual thread under a microscope and determine that it was in fact wool. The other way you can do that is with a burn test, but again, this is a vintage sweater and I am not about to burn test some of this. I don't want to destroy it, but just from the feel of it, it definitely feels like wool. Anytime I put this on, I have really, really sensitive skin, so anytime I'm wearing this, I'm wearing a different layer underneath so that it doesn't directly touch against my skin because it's very scratchy. It is also so warm. It's winter here in California, which does mean chillier days. We're getting high in the 50s, which is probably not that cold, but typically cold enough for me to wear a sweater. I have to take this off after a little bit because I just get way too hot in this sweater. So I think it truly is wool. One of the other things I'm just noticing, and I'm probably gonna fix right after this, is we're having a little bit of the yarn unravel right here. This looks like it was just at the cast off end, so I'm gonna go fix that really quick because I do want to wear this sweater, but this is another reason why I like creating copies of vintage sweaters, because the more you wear your vintage sweaters, the more that the weaknesses get worn out and you have problems like this rearing its head more often. To me, it also looks like special attention was paid to try to match up the pattern as nearly as possible between the front pieces and the sleeves to kind of continue that really nicely. Same with the back. I mean, it's not perfect, but it flows well, so your eye isn't drawn too much, like there isn't too much of a jog between the sleeves and the front and back portions of this sweater. So I do think that I want to copy this sweater exactly, stitch for stitch, count for count, in the exact same gauge. When I wear it, it's that perfect like oversized sweater where you can wear a bunch of layers underneath it so that when you're out in the winter time, this is the only outer layer you're wearing. You don't necessarily need a coat. So I think what I'm going to do now is start counting the stitches so that I can copy this pattern and give myself a general guideline of what to do and copy this color pattern as well. The other consideration that I have going into this is, can I knit this without any side seam? Because this one, the front and back were knit separately, but the sleeve was knit in the round rather than knit flat. And I kind of like the idea of knitting this in the round up until here, but my problem is, and what you can also, it's not as visible on the sleeves, but you can see a little bit where they went from knitting flat to knitting in the round. It's not as visible on camera, but there is a tension difference, and my tension difference from in the round to flat is quite noticeable. So I'm on the fence of whether or not I'm going to do that. That's something to think about. Let's copy those stitch patterns over and see like the rough outline of the sweater that we can knit. So now I have transferred a lot of the information that I could gather from stitch counting into a very rough pattern on this notebook, as you can see. And I think next time we are going to go ahead and get started with copying this sweater. Oh, really quick, the original colorway is absolutely striking, but I found it hard to find that exact shade of like electric orange in that gauge. So instead I went for a little bit more leaning into Christmas colors with Cascade Yarns Cascade 220 Heather. So with these three, with the pattern that I have and the original vintage sweater, I'm gonna try my hand at knitting this up next time. If you're enjoying this Craftmas series and you want to see much more of this vintage knitting, feel free to subscribe because I'll see you again the day after tomorrow. Bye!